Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this BERA webinar series focusing on contemporary curriculum debates in early childhood education and care. My name is Nikki Fairchild, and I'm the convener of the Early Childhood Education and Care SIG alongside Dr. Louise Kay. This is the final of our 3 webinars, which we hope will provoke discussion and debate about the purpose of curriculum in the early years. As part of this webinar series, we invite you to consider how curriculum drives pedagogy and practice, and to reflect on the role of practitioners in this process. We hope you've had an opportunity to read the chapters we shared from the recent book by Claire Cameron and Peter Moss, entitled Transforming Early Childhood in England Towards a Democratic Education. It's free to download if you haven't done so already, and further details can be found on the event flyer. Of particular interest for this presentation might be chapters 7, 8 and 9. So this evening, we'll be listening to Nancy Stewart, the project lead for the development of the Birth to 5 Matters document. Both Louise and I were proud to be part of the steering group for this project and were able to contribute on behalf of BERA as affiliate members of the Early Years Coalition. The format of the session will run as follows. Nancy will do her presentation slides, which will last for approximately 30 minutes, and you'll have the opportunity to ask questions on the Slido app as she talks. At the end of the presentation, we'll have a Q&A session, and Louise will pose questions to Nancy asked during and after the presentation. Now it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Nancy Stewart. Birth to 5 Matters is new, a comprehensive guide for the early years foundation stage, published by the Early Years Coalition. According to the Coalition, Birth to 5 Matters is guidance by the sector for the sector. It draws on previous guidance for the EYFS and has been updated to reflect recent research to meet the needs of practitioners, to respond to current issues in society, to meet the needs of children today, and to lay a strong foundation for their futures. Nancy Stewart, following a long early years career as a teacher, advisor for a local authority and national strategies, consultant and writer, served as project lead in the development of Birth to 5 Matters. So over to you, Nancy.
Thank you, Nikki. And thanks to everyone who's joining us this evening. I'm very pleased to be able to share with you the journey of Birth to 5 Matters so far, which we do hope is the beginning of a much longer purpose and involvement with early years sector. As you'll see on this slide, EYFS guidance by the sector for the sector. I think it is particularly fitting within this seminar series because of the emphasis throughout this on the role of the professional in navigating those complex issues of pedagogy, curriculum, how that fits alongside requirements of particular frameworks is something that we deal with every day. And then themes of democracy and activism amongst the profession, collaborative working. And I think Birth to 5 Matters, as you will see, is quite an exemplar of some of those issues and a large number of professionals coming together to shape and share their understanding of curriculum and pedagogy. So what is Birth to 5 Matters? It is guidance, and it is particularly aimed at being something that's usable, being able to support daily practice on the ground, very much based in the early years foundation stage in the English context. It's built on previous guidance. The EYFS has been in place since 2008-9, and we have had a lot of guidance that people have found supportive. However, of course, it could be improved, and sometimes areas had gone off on tracks that within practice that weren't necessarily in the best interests of children or of practitioners. And so there is a need to look again, to update, to improve. Very much an aim was to meet the needs of practitioners. And so how we know what those needs are is by asking practitioners. And that's been a very strong thread throughout the Birth to 5 Matters process. It is non-statutory guidance, which is a term that has confused a lot of people who have seen the EYFS as an amalgam of the required framework and the guidance that was issued to support practice. The EYFS, however, is separated into the statutory framework, which is required of us, and then the guidance that sits alongside to support practitioners to put it into practice. So Birth to 5 Matters is that, non-statutory. And the aim was to base it on firm principles, stated principles that people could come together and agree on, and that it should be pedagogically sound, based on research, on practice knowledge of what we know about children, how they learn, effective practice, and clear evidence base for the approaches that are described and recommended. The Early Years Coalition is the publisher of Birth to 5 Matters, the producer. As you'll see here, it is an amalgamation of work of different range of types of organizations, but they are all membership organizations in the sector. So these represent tens of thousands of settings. Some of them are across sectors, like the National Education Union will be primarily representing schools, primary schools and nursery schools, etc. We have the Early Years Alliance and the National Day Nurseries Association, which represent thousands of mainly private and voluntary preschool settings. There are organizations who particularly represent members involved in training practitioners, such as CEFTI, the Early Childhood Studies Degrees Network, groups like TACTIC, Early Education, Early Childhood Forum, who represent members coming together to collaborate on policy issues as well as supporting practice, and groups like Montessori, Steiner, and Froebel Trust, who carry the banner for strongly principled early years pedagogy. This coalition, slightly different membership, but this coalition came together when the government decided to reform, they call it, the Early Years Foundation stage in 2018. Their work initially grew out of a consultation that was mainly involving primary schools, very little early years representation. But on the basis of that, they decided to revise the framework. So the coalition came together to say, let's let the early years voice be strongly heard. And the best way we can do that is to speak with one voice. So they joined together in order to present evidence and inform the government's work on the new statutory framework. As part of that process, two major pieces of work were commissioned. One called Getting It Right in the EYFS, which was a literature review of research within the last 10 years, sort of rapid evidence review, to see is what's good about the EYFS, what could be better. And also a survey of over 3,000 practitioners called Mapping the Landscape. What do practitioners think works and could be better? So those were presented to the government, and the government then created their decisions put into place in the new statutory framework. It was published last year as the early adopter version, and some schools, and if they have associated nurseries, they have been trying it out for the last year. But it will become statutory from September for all early years settings. So we have a new requirement in the law as to what our curriculum is based around, etc. We also have now Birth to 5 Matters as non-statutory guidance that sits alongside. and it is to support practitioners in implementing their statutory duties. The statutory framework itself doesn't actually give very much detail about curriculum and pedagogy. In terms of curriculum, it says that there are 7 areas of learning and development, the same 7 that we had before, and that they are the 3 prime areas and 4 specific areas. So that hasn't really changed. Within that, they specify educational programs for each of those. The educational program is a paragraph for each of those 7 areas. And it describes the kinds of activities that they would, that are required, that settings would offer to children to support their development in those areas. However, they are just a paragraph, and it covers from birth to the end of the reception year. So it's very general. We also have within the statutory framework the characteristics of effective teaching and learning. I've grayed them out here and put them a bit to the side because that's what the government has done, actually. They are less clear. They have removed some of the statutory requirement around them. So they have very little focus, and they're not seen as being an integral part of curriculum, although perhaps in the way that people teach and work with children. We also have the early learning goals. 17 early learning goals. And in the past, people have used those as the targets for the curriculum, and particularly in the reception year, used those very much to shape the curriculum. But the government's clear now, they are for the end of the EYFS as children move into year 1. They are not to be used as a curriculum. So we don't even need to think about them as we shape the way that we work with children. However, there is a little confusion there because there is a statutory duty for all settings to support children to work toward those early learning goals. So in a sense, we have to keep them a bit in the background in our minds. It's clear that it does not describe a particular teaching approach. So that's all we have. We have 7 areas, paragraph about each, early learning goals that aren't particularly relevant. So how do we bring that alive within a setting? What is our work with children like? And that's where Birth to 5 Matters comes in, to describe the richness and roundness of holistic practice that will offer children opportunities to flourish within our settings. Birth to 5 Matters is the latest in a long chain of non-statutory guidance. It's different in that in the past, these have been issued by government. So we had the curriculum guidance for the foundation stage, came out in 2000, Birth to 3 Matters in 2002. Then the decision was made to combine those, so we have Birth to 5, birth to the end of the reception year, and what was the daycare standards, the national daycare standards. So we're looking at education and care within one unified framework. This point was the first point where there was the introduction of a statutory element, the statutory framework. And again, it was thin, but there was a lot of non-statutory guidance around that, supporting it. A booklet, a practice guidance, and lots of the cards and the CD with lots of extra information, etc. But all of that non-statutory, which means optional. In 2012, the EYFS went through a revision, and the DFE, or Department for Children, I can't remember what they were called then, Children's Schools and Families, or DFE, at that point commissioned a new version of non-statutory guidance, Development Matters, that has been used very widely in the interim. It is not the EYFS, although many people have considered that confused in their minds, the statutory versus non-statutory elements. With this new revision, effective from September, the government commissioned and published a new guidance document, which they are calling Development Matters. Again, non-statutory curriculum guidance. The Early Years Coalition thought, okay, we have that. There's a lot of material that is not in there that we could enrich for practitioners and support practitioners in a way that brings together wide expertise, and so decided to produce their own non-statutory guidance. So it's within that stream, none of which is required. All of that, you could use any of it. You could use Birth to 3 Matters with your youngest children. You could use any or all or none. So Birth to 5 Matters is guidance by the sector and for the sector. I've explained why we wanted to be for the sector, to prepare people to think about their practice, to support those reflections as they develop their ways of working on day to day with children. But by the sector, we felt was particularly important because of that professional expertise that exists within the early years workforce. And we wanted to pull some of that together and offer that to be something that we could draw on in common, but also very much a support for people new to the profession, students, etc. So the writing team was composed of 20 groups, 20 working groups, who were nominated by the Early Years Coalition organizations, all represented on the steering group. So steering group put forward possible members. They were invited to join, and they were formed into 20 groups, 100 people in total. And a lot were academics, researchers, people involved in teacher training and training practitioners, independent consultants with particular expertise in certain areas, but also practitioners in all sorts of settings. So we had primary schools, nursery chains, nursery schools, childminders, etc. Because what we learn day to day working with children as we continue to learn is also something that needs to be shared. We also wanted to widen out who are we listening to, who's having these conversations that we can all learn from. So we held 3 public consultations, online, totally open, showing the drafts, saying this is what we're thinking of so far, what do you think? We also had a few expert reviewers who looked at drafts and gave us feedback. And we had reference groups, in addition, focus groups of practitioners at the beginning of their career, etc., students and parents and children. All of this happened in an extremely short period of time. We had 6 months from beginning to end. And we recruited the working groups and had our first online survey in October, saying a very open questions about what would you like it to be. And the first draft grew out of that by mid-December. First draft went live, people commented, took that back, second draft in February, took in the comments, and then the final version was published at the very end of March. When we went to ask the sector in our surveys, we wanted to know who are we hearing from. We asked them, what's your role? And as you can see on this chart, 75% were people working daily in settings and schools, so working with children. So those were the people that we particularly wanted to hear from. And where did they work? A very good spread across the types of settings that we have in the sector. So we've got a rounded view. We did find that the majority were more highly qualified and more experienced than many in the sector, which is why we also ran the focus groups and reference groups to hear from people newer into the roles. And that proportion remained the same through all three of our open consultations, 3/4 on the ground working with children. What they said was, we want more on play. We want characteristics of effective learning. We want to see a developmental pathway, a trajectory, but not prescriptive. We do want it to support us to observe, assess, and plan, but not for use as a checklist. We would like to do periodic summative assessment with best fit bands. Additional resources, please, for CPD of themselves and their team, etc. SEND, EAL, etc. Emphasize well-being. Update, improve it. There are things that could be better, but also don't change too much because people were finding the existing guidance helpful. Overall, the EYFS as a principled, play-based approach, endorsement of those principles of the unique child, positive relationships, enabling environments, and learning and development. And so the guidance is shaped around that, with this understanding that children, the unique child, brings who they are to their learning and development experience, and what they meet as they engage in relationships and environments, which adults have the responsibility to provide. That interaction leads to the learning and development. So we had a lot of specific comments. This is an example of how seriously we took what practitioners were telling us. Well, what anyone who responded to the consultations were telling us. On draft 2, we had, along with many hundreds of other comments on other issues, 674 specific comments on the draft text. All of those were sorted out and went back to the relevant working group with the request that each comment had a notation. We wanted to note, did you act on this? Yes or no? If yes, just put yes, and then go and change it in the draft. You'll see here an awful lot of smiley faces, and that's because by the time we got to draft 2, a lot of the comments were just very positive, so didn't require a change. But if you say no, why not? Give your reason, and including, is there evidence that you would refer to? And so we have the records of every single comment having been taken seriously and built into to improve the final product. What about the children? Did we ask children? Well, we really wanted to know what matters to children. And the first thing that we thought about, because in 6 months it's very difficult to do a proper exercise of listening to children. But the first thing we thought about was, we think because we're listening to all these practitioners who work with children, who have children's interests at heart, they in a sense are serving as proxy advocates for those children. So first of all, let's just have a go. We're going to make a word cloud. And what I'd like you to do is think, well, if you ask children who are involved in earlier settings, what matters most? What do you like best? What do you love about your setting? What do you think they would say? So what I'd like you to do on our word cloud is enter 3 words that you think, just keywords, not long phrases, but 3 things that you think children would say. And we'll see where we get to. I see one has appeared already. Oh, it's got bigger, and we have others. Interesting in this time of thinking about post-pandemic, what have children most missed? What will be important for us to highlight and foster for them as they return? Teachers, friends, choice. Playing friends is still remaining enormous, isn't it? Key person. So we have a few key people, a few things about the adults. Teacher, friends, play, adults. The garden, outdoors, getting a few of these. Toys, play and playing. Yes, that's interesting, isn't it? The active side of play, that for children it's not play, which is a concept for us, but for children it's playing, it's doing it, isn't it? What else is coming up? Learning is there. Snack time, break. Trees, blocks. Being outside again. Give it another couple of seconds. I think we've come to a pause. So let's remember what's big here. Friends, play, and toys and playing. Well as asking our participants in all the working groups and so on to think about the perspective of children, we also had two elements of trying ourselves to listen to children. One was a survey to which we had 137 responses of parents and children. So what was important to parents in their child setting, and then asking the parents to ask the children. So we had quotes and the children's words as to what mattered to them. We also had a very diligent and quickly done in her spare free time literature review by Professor Sasha Powell, who surveyed examples that she could find within the last, I can't remember if it was 5 or 10 years, of studies listening to children, directly children's voices. And she also did a thematic review of those and did a thematic analysis of the survey. And so I'll show you what we came up with from that. So here's what the children said. They had play as the biggest, but friends was next. And outdoors was there, the adults involved, key people. And the importance of movement as a theme came through very much, whether it was indoors or outdoors, but, doing, moving. Certainly friends, you can see there in 4 out of those 5. And so I think practitioners do know about what children take seriously, but it was good to ask them directly as well. So what we came up with then is a core document, which is available on the Birth to 5 Matters website as a free download. And there will also be printed copies available at basically cost price. So those can be ordered also on the website. As you see from the contents page, it starts with foundations of highest quality, spelling out those principles and how those play into the importance of voice and inclusion, play, care, integrally interwoven in all provision, quality improvement in leadership, transitions, and then specific sections on each of those thematic areas. We also have an online version. So rather than downloading or using the print version, you can look at it directly online, where the complete text of the document is on the various web pages. And at the end of each page, there are places you can click for additional resources that we were asked to provide, which include case studies, practical tools, much more in-depth information, further reading, further guidance, links to other useful sites, etc. There is also a link on each page to the bibliography, which was the evidence base for that section, for that working group that developed that text, and can be useful for students. There's also a section on the background, how it was produced and so on, a frequently asked questions page. Additional resources include videos, including a new one produced on characteristics of effective learning, which will be really helpful, I anticipate, for training, for staff to use together, and very much to share with parents. So it also says there, and CPD in brackets, because that is the next phase of Birth to 5 Matters. A new coordinator for the next phase is being appointed shortly, who will take forward organizing a CPD and dissemination program to support people to engage with Birth to 5 Matters. The bibliography, in the additional resources tab that you can see there, has, as well as the section bibliography on each page, there is the overall bibliography, and that includes also the one on children and listening to children. These sections include a lot of new work, and you'll see some of these are very topical. Wider context communities, sustainability, inclusive practice and equalities, self-regulation, which there is now an early learning goal around self-regulation, but it's quite poorly articulated and difficult for some people to understand. So there's information and further resources there. And child development, new material on play and characteristics of effective learning. So well worth engaging with. We also have added a couple of examples showing that although the EYFS looks at 7 areas of learning and development and the characteristics, actually, we need to look at it as a whole. Every child is constantly learning, so every experience is a learning opportunity and experience for children. So these are examples of everyday things and describing within each of those areas of learning and characteristics what we might see children encountering and developing. We have built on previous guidance. So we had the guidance around formative assessment, very much starting with observation. Start where the child is, see what the child is showing you, telling you, doing, and then think about it, assess, think, what does that mean? How can I understand the child and what they might be thinking about and what they're wondering about from this? And then how can I plan? But there's a lot more information here, as well as, again, additional resources. So it's a way in through something that's familiar. I would point out that in the statutory framework, observation has almost been removed. I think it's because the government has been very rightly concerned to stop the practice of endless tick listing and thinking of observations just as a chance to make a tick on a tick list. And so they've taken that off, thinking that it means that there's too much paperwork. Whereas what we're stressing is we do need to observe. It doesn't mean paperwork. It means tuning in, being aware, wondering about children as a result of what we notice. So, curriculum. What is it? How do we work with it? According to the DFE, the curriculum should be based on those 7 areas of learning and development. They don't say it should be based on the characteristics of effective learning, those 7 educational programs. They define it as what you should know within those. Ofsted is even more explicit. They have said it is what children know and what they're expected to know. And they're promoting a progression model where settings are encouraged to set out particular steps to get from where they are now to where you have said you want them to be. And you've got to know what you've got to do to get them there. They look in their new framework at curriculum intent. So what did you want them to learn? Implementation, how are you going about it? And impact. Were you successful? What did teachers intend that pupils would remember? Was the question that is stated. And have they got those golden nuggets of knowledge into their long-term memories? Well, that's one view of curriculum. But in Birth to Five Matters, we would question that. We would say curriculum does need to hang from your values. What do you want for children? So when we think, what is it we want children to learn? Is it just knowledge within those areas? Or is it thinking about children's well-being, about their confidence in who they are as learners, and their curiosity and their motivation and their creative and critical thinking? We talk about not starting from a progression list, but start with the child and grow together. And that it's not a staircase, a straight linear progression. It weaves in and out and can change. And that the construction of that is done together, children, adults, including parents. So start with what children know and what they can do. And yes, adults have a responsibility to introduce new ideas and knowledge, things that children wouldn't come across on their own, and to be that sensitive support and guide. But more than a list of skills and knowledge, but how children are learning and how are they learning about themselves as learners. So the areas of learning and development, we have made trajectories, but we've been very, very clear. These are not prescriptive, not for children who will work their own way on their own pathway, not for adults in terms of the suggestions under relationships and environments. Those are examples to prompt professional reflective thinking, to adapt to meet the children they're working with. We had a lot of discussion about how we would present that progression through the various areas of learning, because people wanted that. They wanted it to support child development knowledge, to help them know if children needed extra support. So we had various options. One is, would you like us to just put babies, toddlers, young children? Don't put ages on it. And we asked them to rank their choices. First choice. A third of people wanted that for their first choice. But it was very divisive. A third of people said last choice. They wouldn't like it. We asked them about using overlapping ages in two different styles. We could use it with ovals overlapping or blocks. And those had fewer people opposing it. Overall, the overlapping ovals, if you look at first and second choice, was more popular. But we also said, shall we keep it the way it is? And actually, no, people were up for a change. So this is what we've come up with. We have divided it into ranges and without ages. And so when you look through, you start where the child is, not with an age. But then we have a key so that people can map against when they once or twice a year want to have a look at a summative assessment. Are they where most children might be around that age in a non-prescriptive way? And these were our purposes. And when we asked if we had met those purposes, there was a very strong endorsement. Overall, it's been very, very positively received. I heard last week, after 3 weeks, for instance, publication, there'd been over 24,000 downloads and 47,000 people viewing the launch material. So we hope that it will be useful for people, that they will have a look and find material that will support them in their work day to day, as well as room to dig deeper in the additional material. And So with a final thanks to all of the participants in putting it together, I want to thank you for having an engagement with us this evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nancy. That was, I really enjoyed, and as someone who actually observed more than participated in the process of developing the Birth to Five Matters, it never ceases to amaze me what a task you undertook, and in such a short space of time and with so many voices. So I'm going to ask people to pop questions in the chat, any questions that you might have for Nancy, but just while we're waiting for those to come in, you talk, and this is something that underpins some of my research, you talked about the early learning goals, and the government has explicitly stated that they're not to be used as the curriculum, but they keep having to say this over and over again. Do you think at this point now it's actually written in the EYFS, the revised version, that people might start to think about the early learning goals in a little bit, you know, in regards to curriculum and the Birth to Five Matters in a different way?
I think so. I think it is a culture change. In fact, I don't think that, other than reception year, I don't think that people have been using early learning goals as the curriculum, but they have been using Development Matters 2012 in a very prescriptive way. And, you know, going through the tick list and, oh, here's a statement a child hasn't reached, so we need to plan that, as if every child needs to show evidence of every one of those statements. And it gives people a sense of safety, to feel that they know what they're doing and they're doing the right thing. And so I have heard a number of people say that they're concerned about how they will make that shift. But I do think that there is a unified voice now from the DFE, from Ofsted, from Birth to Five Matters, from Development Matters, that that's not the way that is most effective for supporting children, and is not true to children's development. So I think we will see a change now.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a positive note. I've got a couple of questions here. So Lisa asks, is the obsession with memorizing not just going back to the whole notion of rote learning again?
Well, yes, I would say it is. It's unfortunate. I think the main area where we have memorizing is in the maths goals, which there is one statement about number bonds without using any aids, etc. So instant recall. I think that's the main one, but it's worth bearing in mind that those early learning goals are not the curriculum. That's the only place that we actually have that emphasis on memorization. They're not the curriculum. And if we think about the aim of that, it's to give children facility and fluency with number. And we can think of how we do that in an authentic way, giving children lots of real experiences of using and manipulating number. So we don't need to think of it as memorizing. I think that isn't what we want. We want children who can make links with things that they know and understand from one circumstance to another. And yes, holding bits of information in your long-term memory, which is the way some people are describing learning, is, I think, not one I would go along with. And that's up to us as professionals to decide how we approach that.
Thank you. So Tammy asks, how much do you think practitioners will be able to implement and draw on your guidance in the context of pressures to do otherwise from Ofsted and the Department for Education?
I think that people will be totally free to draw on Birth to Five Matters if they choose to do so. The Department for Education has made it clear that all non-statutory guidance is optional, although they are recommending using Development Matters. Ofsted has made it very clear that they will have no expectation of people using any particular guidance, and how you go about organizing your curriculum and supporting your own thinking about where children are and how you support them is totally up to you. So I think that there's not going to be a problem there. We have had people saying that we need to work more with leaders and managers to help leaders and managers to engage with the materials and to make those decisions and become familiar with it, because people will feel pressure if they're in an academy chain, you know, what is the academy perspective, etc. So those are things that over coming months people will be grappling with. One reason we wanted to give ourselves a very tight deadline and have this published by the end of March was that there is at least the summer term. So we have the whole term for people to have a look and think before the statutory responsibility in September.
I was also interested in the DFE's assertion that the good level of development is not a high stakes accountability assessment construct, which certainly didn't come out of my own doctoral research. It was very much classroom practice was driven, which was a complete surprise to me, actually. I looked at school readiness. That was driving classroom practice. So hopefully that assertion from the DFE on the recommendation from Ofqual will also hopefully reduce the pressures that the GLD is perhaps placing on reception teachers at the moment. So all these things might come together and create a much more or a much less, you know, high stakes assessment at the end of reception.
Yes, I think that's possible and would be very positive. I've always thought that the GLD, including the primaries, and then literacy and numeracy, which are the very challenging and arguably inappropriate levels, was unfortunate and, as you say, caused a lot of pressure. I think we should be a little wary of reason behind reducing emphasis on the outcome of the profile and the good level of development, because I think one of the reasons for that is they want to put all the emphasis on the reception baseline instead, which is a terrible idea as well. So, you know, it swings and roundabouts, isn't it?
It is. Thank you for that comment. That's really interesting for me. Very relevant to my research. I've got a few more comments. So Nathan asks, the development has been a phenomenal achievement and a real feat of coordination. So many congratulations to the team. Do you have any reflections on the process of this grassroots response from the sector and whether we might see further by the sector for sector responses in ECEC?
Well, my reflection really has been being overwhelmed and stunned by the willingness of people to share their time, their thought, and the goodwill, because it was not all smooth sailing and 100% agreement all the time within working groups and sometimes between working groups. And there were people who felt, wait, you know, I've got something important to say. And we were always able to make time to listen to that and to have a meeting and find the common point. So I feel hugely positive about the capacity of the early years sector to work together. And even the fact that the coalition has worked together so successfully, I think is a really good marker. Initially, the coalition was going to do this and then wrap up. It was a task and finish, but now they recognize there is a need to support ongoing development. So I think it could be both something that carries on growing itself, but hopefully a model for educational professionals to work together in a constructive way.
Thank you. So Kath asks, what have you learned from leading this enormous sector-led project?
Well, I have learned that one thing, of course, is I've learned more about, as I've said, that commitment and generosity. But I've also learned that people often have a specific area in which they have a very intense interest and intensely focused knowledge. And it's been really interesting to see the cross-fertilization of that when we've brought people together. And so, for instance, someone with a very strong interest in physical development might really have something to say to people looking at PSED and development of sense of self. And, that those opportunities to listen across areas of specialism are very fertile ground. And I've found that really, really interesting and positive.
Thank you. One thing so Jan asks the next question. One thing we noticed about previous iterations of the EYFS and Australia's EYLF is its multi-voicedness. We all follow different routes to come to understand early years provision, how children learn, and the values we hang on it. When the sector speaks with one voice, can we keep our different perspectives?
That's a really interesting question and really important, and was raised a number of times, so that the preface of Birth to Five Matters, which was written by the steering group, went round and round to make sure that that came through, that we can agree some common important threads, but the core message has to be that people use their understanding of their own context and their own professional understanding and their own values and theories to build on that and make it their own. So it's not meant to be a narrowing down, but meant to be a very broad base of things to think about and grist to the mill for people to work in their own ways and not to prescribe. And we've said very clearly, it's not a recipe. It's a recipe book. It's a rich set of resources for your own thinking.
Thank you. So Marco asks, Jim, I don't know if I'm going to say this name correctly, Jimeno Sacristan thinks about the curriculum in a complex way, integrating cultural and political dimensions influencing practices. Such practices are filtered through practitioners' interpretations. Is it time to problematize the way we think about curriculum in early childhood?
It certainly is, yes. I totally agree. I'm not familiar with that work, but clearly curriculum exists in a context. If you even take the government's definition that curriculum is the high level statements of what you want children to learn, I would put it much more broadly than to learn, what you would want children to experience, to develop within themselves, etc. Thinking of every moment as part of your curriculum. But even if you take it as that, as what we want children to learn, then that's hugely culturally and politically bound, isn't it? And I think that we need to open that out and say, what are the underlying assumptions here? And are they necessary? Are they right? Are they ones that we would endorse? What is this all about? I think is a question that we should come back to in a very probing way.
Thank you. And I think hopefully some of the discussions that we've had as part of this webinar have started to, ask questions about or problematize what curriculum means in early childhood education, and also thinking about the curriculum gap between the end of the foundation stage and the start of the national curriculum, which seems to be an ongoing issue as well for children who don't meet the good level of development in particular. So unless anybody has got any more questions, I've not got any on the Slido app. We've got another question that's just popped up. So Lisa asks, will the resources included and on the website be updated regularly?
They will be updated. I can't tell you how regularly. The post that is being appointed for the new coordinator is, I think, a 6-month post in the first instance. So that will be tidying up and, sorting out the initial side. There is a commitment that the coalition has made to do a review in 3 years and another in 5 years. Whether there is continuity between those periods, I can't say. That's something that the coalition steering group will need to look at, whether there is any funding stream to allow for someone to do that, and so on. I don't really know, but I think that that's one of those things that initially was going to be, right, it's done, and the awareness is there that it should be a growing and living document and set of resources. So I expect it will be to some degree, but I can't give any detail really.
That's great. Thank you, Nancy. Really good news for the sector for ongoing engagement with Birth to 5 Matters. So we don't have any more questions. We are just coming up to past. So I'd like to thank Nancy for taking the time to talk to us this evening about the Birth to 5 Matters. We will be doing a blog, hopefully, that will address some of the discussion points that we've raised as part of this webinar series, so keep your eye open for that. And also just to thank everybody for attending the webinar series. If you've managed to make all 3, I know some people have. Thank you for your attendance and your engagement in the discussions. So I think that's a wrap.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.